Welcome back to Shadows of the Past, where we shine our light on the shadows of history. In today's episode, we'll be talking about a subject that is near and dear to my heart growing up in the South. Wrestling. No. Don't click away. Please don't click away. It'll be good. It's hard not to be drawn to these larger-than-life characters engaging in bombastic violence, a brutal soap opera playing out to a gladiatorial end. Never knowing that most of these men were not the true reflection of the mirror that they showed. One of the best kept secrets of the business until the 2000s. It would not be the only secret the business would have. In this world, there existed a man known for being as decent outside of the ring as he was a tyrant inside. A career man who did everything he could to preserve his job that was taken from him far too quickly. Join me as we go through the events that lead to him slowly bleeding out on a shower floor and the injustice that would soon follow. Let's delve into the shadows.
I think that anybody who's looking at me right now could attest to the fact that you can watch all of the football you want on television, all the collegiate football, all of the professional football you want, and you enjoy it. But there's no feeling like sitting in those stands and rooting for your team and jumping up and down and having your emotion in it. You can't do that on TV. When people look at Bruiser, Brody on TV, they don't get near as emotional as they do as when they're sitting there at ringside. So all these people in all these rural communities, if they don't have a chance to go out there and actually touch Bruiser Brody and see him in person, he's really not at the top of his business. He can only be at the top of his business when he reaches those in New York City, those in Waxahachie, Texas, those in Blueville, West Virginia, those in Uniontown, Pennsylvania. You can only be the top when all wrestling fans get to be in touch with you, and that can't be done just on TV.
This hulking man with the tangled mass of hair has gone by a lot of names in his lifetime. Bruiser Brody, King Kong Brody, the Masked Marauder, and Red River Jack, but he would never forget who he started out as, Frank Goodish. His love of physicality would show early when he began to play football for Warren High School in Michigan, eventually leading to college play at West Texas A&M. He would go on to play for the Redskins for 3 more years before leaving the team to become a sports writer. Teammates stating that he tended to have issues with authority, often arguing with the coaches. He also had a hard time being a team player. This would be a reoccurring theme in his life. This eventually led him to meeting Ivan Putski, a famous wrestling villain while lifting weights. Fritz von Erich of the prestigious and tragic wrestling family would train Brody in the business that the massive 6'8", 300-pound monster would zealously engage in until his untimely murder. And it seems that Goodish understood the business far better than most would expect from this character.
With me is the 320-pound Bill.
Yahoo! Yahoo! That's right. Bruiser Brody. That's right. Cowboy Bill Watts. I done heard the call of my friend Stan Hansen. I heard it way over here in Texas. Yeah, that's right. You're a little bit jealous of my friend now that he's got the North American Heavyweight Championship belt proudly around his waist. You're just a little jealous you can't wait to get a chance at him. Well, let me tell you something. My man Stan Hansen is a gentleman. He is a man of integrity and honesty. And the way I hear it, he wants nothing to do with filth like you. So he's bringing in yours truly. Just take you right out of the picture. That's right, me. I'm coming in to make sure that you spend the most of your time in that ring on your back.
Where both wrestlers are in complete sync. When one lifts, the other pushes. This is all while trying to protect the integrity of the character that they are playing. The one character most would play until the end. This is something that Brody understood so well, that to play a character that is a loose cannon and a violent powerhouse, you must appear dominant. And for this character to have any kind of longevity within the business, that brutal aura must be protected. This was a time when the wrestlers did everything they could to blend the lines of reality and fantasy and would stay in character anytime they would be in the general public, usually going as far as not to allow in-ring enemies to be seen together in public in fear of breaking the illusion. Wrestling was hinging on the suspension of disbelief, and for you to buy in that the matches aren't predetermined and that these characters before you are who they say they are. And Goodish really played that character up.
Would you be willing to talk about, in your case it's especially different, how one night you're a fan favorite challenging for a title, and a few hundred or 1,000 miles away from here tomorrow you could be everybody's most dreaded nightmare trying to beat their favorite. And that must be a weird thing to adjust from one day to the next. You're different people.
I don't think it's a hard adjustment problem after 15 years. In the beginning, if you would go somewhere and people would, let's say, choose you as the one they wanted to see beat, it might irritate you a little bit. After doing it for so many years, you find out that your business is in the ring and the fans' business is in the stands. And as a paying customer, he must have the right to choose who he wants to win.
You're making his mind up by how you portray yourself.
I don't think so. It seems strange that I might go to a real conservative small town like Salina, Kansas, and be so acceptable with a ponytail, when every father out there is hoping that his son doesn't have a ponytail. People's emotions and people's thinkings are deeper than just what they see on the outside. I think that people, when they make a judgment about somebody, I think it's because they either know something personal about him or they don't know anything about him. And in my case, when I go to some parts of the country, they've been watching me for so long, they know what's inside, so it's easy for them to like me. On the other hand, I'll go to another part of the country where they only see me a few times and they'll look and they'll say, this is the kind of guy that I'm not so sure about, so they make a different type of judgment about.
But if I haven't seen you before, if I see you on one night, you're forcing the issue, you're more aggressive than maybe any wrestler I've ever seen. On another night, you're letting the other guy be the aggressor for a little while and then responding, reacting to him. You're causing the action in one case, you're reacting in another.
Okay, first of all, I think that everybody who's looking at me right now should understand that Bruiser Brody never let anyone do anything to him. I don't know about the other professional wrestlers. I only know about Bruiser Brody. And when I go in the ring, it doesn't matter whether I'm in Texas or New York, or it doesn't matter whether people like me or dislike me, I'm going to be just as aggressive every night. Now, some nights it may look like I'm not aggressive. If I do this 30 nights in a row, sometimes these old legs, they don't go as good as they did 15 days ago. Sometimes physically, I don't feel good either. And sometimes my performance may not be what it was the night before. But when I do go in the ring, anybody who signs a contract to wrestle Bruiser Brody must know that he's going to be aggressive to the best of his ability.
Brody wrestled at a time before wrestling became ruled by a handful of dominant companies and instead was broken up into various territories across the country like warring nations. And Brody was able to go between almost any of them, despite his reputation for being hard to deal with when it came to the bookers, the ones deciding the outcomes. But this butting of heads is not so out of the ordinary when you consider how often the man determining the fate of the wrestlers and the wrestlers not wanting to receive unnecessary losses have different ideas. Wrestling was his job, and he fought tooth and nail to secure that he'd have another paycheck. Brody's popularity preceding him and speaking volumes with droves of fans going crazy as soon as his entrance music hit. A reward for that dedication that he would put in. His reputation for being hard to work with would not be only for the bookers though. Brody was known for being stiff in the ring if he didn't feel respected. Usually the wrestlers do everything they can to protect one another and make sure both get hurt as little as possible while performing these over-the-top moves. but a wrestler may decide to go rogue and start actually trying to hurt the other person while performing, doing things like closing their fists when they strike, or putting all their weight into the force of impact when landing on their opponent. And so, Bruiser Brody became almost as feared outside the ring as in. And while I don't agree with any of his violent methods, I also understand the part of this was to make sure that his opponents made him look like the monster that he needed to be, and if they were not working to Brody's standards, he was definitely going to let them know. All the action happens on the fly, so sometimes wrestlers decide to go into business for themselves. This can lead to some horrific moments. While there are many stories of his overzealous violence towards those uncooperative while in the ring, there are many about his kindness and respect while outside of it. Many wrestlers describing him as a quiet, intelligent guy who was a family man through and through. Another wrestler, Al Snow, has a story about Brody that I think paints the complex nature of his own personal character pretty well. Snow mentions that he was a rookie wrestler who was beaten badly in the head while in the ring a week before. It ended up blurring his vision, and he was still recovering when he was booked in the match with Bruiser Brody. This absolutely terrified Snow due to his reputation. Brody walked into the bar that the other wrestlers were drinking at, and Snow decided to take this opportunity to talk to him. He told Brody about the head injury and asked if hitting him in the head could be avoided. Brody responded, "Just fight back and you'll be okay." After this, Snow was still terrified. So the match went underway the next day. Al Snow and his friend, who is also a rookie, would be a tag team against the veteran monster, Bruiser Brody. Snow said that, still being green, he wasn't performing incredibly well, but he was fighting back and letting Brody toss him around for a good while, all while wanting nothing more than to tag his friend so that he can stand on the apron away from his opponent's painful strikes. This relief would not come anytime soon. At one point during the match, Brody would grab Snow by his hair and in smart wrestling narrative would go to kick Snow's tag team partner so he wouldn't be able to interrupt the pin. Snow said that the kick must have dazed his partner because he was just loosely hanging on the ropes as if reeled. Snow would quietly yell for his partner to fall, knowing this being Brody's intention, and knowing the repercussions for going into business for oneself with a veteran. Still dazed, Snow's partner held fast onto the ropes. So Brody gave a grunt and proceeded to drive that massive boot into his partner's face. His nose would erupt in a fountain of blood, and his body skidded across the concrete floor. Brody would then hit Snow with his finisher and pin him. Brody would soon meet up with Snow and his partner in the back and would ask Snow, "You alright, kid?" Snow would say, Yeah, I'm okay. Everything okay?" Brody would tell him, "Yeah, you fought back. I just kicked your ass. That's alright. Thank you very much. Sorry about your friend." And then walked off. Snow said that despite working a little stiff in other areas, Brody never touched his head or did anything that would injure it, working safe the whole time. And this was Brody. And this demeanor may be one of the many parts in the puzzle of why he may have been viciously stabbed. Let me begin with saying that some of this is alleged, as part of the information is used from wrestler interviews, and they can sometimes be unreliable narrators. So I've parsed through it the best I can, and it all starts in Puerto Rico in July of 1988. Brody was there to wrestle for the World Wrestling Council, a large wrestling promotion in Puerto Rico at the time. Brody had flown in early on the 14th to film promos and start the tour with Jose Gonzalez, known as Invader One and the booker for the WWC. Along with him was Victor Quiñones, who handled everything with the box office, and who Brody considered his best friend in Puerto Rico. Both business partners to Carlos Colon and Victor Jovica, the owners of the WWC. Colon himself being a wrestler that reached Hulk Hogan levels of popularity in his native country. If there was bad blood between Brody and any of these men, no evidence of it presented itself until the tragedy on the 16th.
Be in the ring with Carlos Colon! Carlos Colon!
On July 16th, Brody would ride into Bayamon with fellow American wrestlers Dutch Mantell and Tony Atlas. The time would be 7:15 p.m. with showtime at 8:30. Gonzalez, Quinones, and Colon would be huddled together in silence around a table. Gonzalez then left and came back with a white towel wrapped around his hand. He would ask Brody to have a private meeting with him in the bathroom, saying, "Brody, mi amigo, come here por favor." It was not unusual for the booker and a wrestler to speak before the show, and with everything seeming cordial between the two, Brody obliged. Within 5 seconds of the two turning the corner into the bathroom, sickening screams rang out. Wrestlers in the locker room ran towards the commotion, watching as Brody was pushing himself backwards away from Gonzalez, who was swiping at his neck with an 8-inch blade. Brody stumbles and hits the floor, with the wrestlers gathering around, witnessing the 2 deep puncture wounds in his stomach and chest. A doctor soon comes to check on him with grim findings. His lung pierced, liver punctured, and the air bubbles the doctor would see appearing in his blood meant that his arteries had been severed. Brody was still conscious. Carlos Colon arrived to the locker room soon after. Brody pleaded with Colon as he lay bleeding on the floor. "No matter what happens, please take care of my boy." A family man till the end. During this time, Gonzalez had a shouting match with his business partner, Victor Jovica. He then walked around everyone in the room, grabbed his bag, and then left the building. An ambulance would be called for Brody, but unfortunately, due to traffic from another event going on nearby, it would take half an hour to get to the stadium. Even worse, the paramedics were not able to lift him into the ambulance, his hulking 300-plus pound frame feeling like a metric ton. Tony Atlas had been nearby when this happened and was able to scoop up Brody and get him into the ambulance. Atlas would also ride with him to the hospital, singing an old song, "If Heaven Ain't a Lot Like Dixie," and giving reassurance. The hospital refused to let Atlas stay though, and he headed back to the stadium. The locker room continued to prepare for the show despite the chaos that had just erupted, rumors and misinformation flying everywhere. Some even claiming that it was someone other than Gonzalez who had attacked Brody. And speaking of Gonzalez, when he left the building, it appears that he went home, had changed his shirt, and then drove back to the stadium. After arriving, he acted completely normal, telling the locker room to go on with the show as normal. The wrestlers did as they were told, Gonzalez not speaking of the stabbing that happened minutes prior. WWC officials would tell the wrestlers that they had believed Brody stabilized that night, something they would reiterate to the press. That would not be the case. When Dutch Mantell arrived back to the hotel after the show, he was kind enough to ask the hotel clerk to forward any calls for Brody to himself. In the meantime, Colon's wife Nancy called Frank's wife Barbara. Barbara being awoken from her sleep in the dead of the night, Nancy told her that a terrible accident had happened and she should get to Puerto Rico as soon as possible, but couldn't offer up any more information. Barbara thought it was a prank and called Brody's hotel to get in touch. It was forwarded to Mantell, who told Barbara that things were pretty serious and she should fly out, though he didn't really have any details. Mantell would have trouble sleeping and asked the hotel clerk to call the hospital to check on Brody. The clerk speaks in her native tongue, leaving Mantell in the dark. Her face would then erupt in tears. She would tell Mantell that Brody didn't make it. He had unfortunately died that night. Mantell would be shaken. Barbara arrived with her and Brody's son Jeffrey. She would meet at the hospital with another wrestler and friend of Brody's, Abdullah the Butcher, who broke the tragic news that Brody had died that night on the operating table. Barbara would have to cremate Brody in order to bring him back to the States. There would be another wrestling show the following day on the 17th. Gonzalez had showed up all fired up and ready to go, while Carlos Colon would tell the wrestlers that going on with the show would be what Brody wanted. The nerve. But most of the American wrestlers no-showed, getting early flights out, which is pretty reasonable under the circumstances, and so the show would be cancelled. Gonzalez would be arrested on the 18th for first-degree murder and weapons violations. He would post bond soon after, the police not able to recover the murder weapon. Savio Vega, another wrestler present that night, speculates that it might have ended up in the river near the home of Gonzalez in that random excursion he decided to take after the stabbing. The preceding trial and investigation would be an absolute farce. Remember how I spoke of wrestling doing everything they can to blur the lines of reality? Unfortunately, that can work too well. The police, when questioning the wrestlers that night, did not take things seriously. They had believed that all this might be part of some angle for the promotion. It also did not help that the witness with the most info at the time, Tony Atlas, had his testimony translated by Invader 2, Jose Gonzalez's tag partner, at the scene. Those blurred lines of reality continued to affect things even more as the defense used the Bruiser Brody character as an indictment on who Frank Goodish was, using his prevalence for the over-the-top violence and even more over-the-top character work to paint a picture of a violent madman. The prosecution would call for the witness testimony of some of the American wrestlers, but their subpoena would not arrive until 10 days after the verdict had already been reached. And that verdict? Gonzalez was acquitted on self-defense, the character assassination winning out. The promoters acting as if they were completely blind to the situation, as Colon would demonstrate here.
What are your early memories of Bruiser Brody? The very first time you ever met Bruiser Brody?
Good. You know, he was a good guy.
What was it like to work with him inside the ring?
I was a little stiff, but he's good. You know, he wouldn't hurt you.
Was he ever difficult behind the scenes at all, or?
Well, no, not with me. I really never had any problem with him.
Easy to get along with, and
Yeah, he was.
obviously he was good business for the company.
Yeah, big business. Other than Abby, he was the next.
When the paramedics first arrived, did they think it was an angle at all, or did they know?
I don't know really. It's been so long ago and so sad. I really, I would want to talk about this anymore because it
Okay.
makes you sad.
I just have a couple more questions, and we'll definitely move on. Did you ever want to cancel the show that night at all, or did you just?
No, we were so confused, and I don't even know what I was doing. Nobody was.
Do you think it was self?
Because we never had anything like that happen
Right.
before or since. And it was terrible.
Do you think there was a cover up at all? I mean, we did interviews with like Tony Atlas and Savio Vega, and they said that The Office covered up the actual murder. And I mean, do you think there was a cover up at all?
No, the only guy that could have covered was Jovic and I, and we didn't do that.
Right.
We told the judge and the courtroom, we said what we saw. We didn't really, because I didn't see any stabbing, I didn't see any weapon, I didn't see anything.
Do you think it was a case of self-defense? Do you think that? I mean, obviously, Jose Gonzalez said that it was self-defense. Do you believe it was really self-defense?
Well, I don't know, really. I don't know. I respect the law.
Right. Dutch Mantel said that when we did an interview with Dutch, he claimed that he didn't receive his subpoena, I guess, until the day after the trial had ended. Do you believe that, or?
I don't know, really. I don't know, 'cause I don't know.
At what point did you say, all right, I'm going to either continue to work with Jose Gonzalez or not work with him? I mean, how did that decision come about for you to continue working with Jose Gonzalez after that incident?
Well, he when he came, innocent, then we couldn't really hold that against him because, we'd be being prejudiced.
Right.
So the big question then is, why did all of this happen? What could have caused the man to be brutally stabbed to death in a locker room shower? There have been answers that have been given, all unsatisfactory. The police statement reading that Brody had refused to lose to another wrestler that night, and so a tussle broke out. That seems pretty illogical, as Brody showed up in a relatively good mood, not ready to combat the booker. It also doesn't match the timeline. He had been in Puerto Rico a few days with those guys. Some newspapers reported money issues, but the amount would have been settled before Brody flew out, and the check would have arrived when he got home. So not likely. This leaves two other more likely scenarios, but still without a decent motivation. Gonzalez was being pushed as the next top Puerto Rican star, but he had a match with Brody where he was beat without mercy. Mantell had said that Gonzalez and Brody had never really liked each other. Gonzalez ended up going to the hospital and never reached the fame that he believed that he deserved. This would be a horrific reason to murder another man, but not absolutely out of the question, when several wrestlers had spoken about the temper that Gonzalez possesses. Some had also said that Gonzalez's daughter had died a week earlier in a tragic drowning incident, painting a man in a desperate frame of mind. But the drowning had actually happened 6 months prior. And while this is a tragedy that I hope no human would ever have to go through, I would hope that 6 months would be enough time just to be able to process this and not be able to stab someone with an 8-inch knife, especially for someone who didn't seem involved. The other rumor came from referee Frank Manning, who said that the WWC owed Brody $25,000 and Brody wasn't leaving Puerto Rico without the money. Brody was also planning to buy into the WWC, becoming a part owner himself. It suggested that if Brody would become part owner, he would remove Gonzalez as one of the first things that he would do. This seemed to be the most probable scenario, with Brody's business sense and the tempestuous attitude that he shared with Gonzalez in the ring. It also had the most stakes out of any of the explanations, but at the same time still serves as a god-awful reason for someone having to die. And there really isn't any evidence of it. The only person who truly knows is Jose Gonzalez, and he isn't speaking up. Well, except in a promo that he did in the 2000s.
En la lucha libre, porque a mí me han pasado unas cosas en la lucha libre que es bien difícil. A mí, yo tengo unas heridas en el corazón bien grandes. A mí se me ahogó una nena de 1 año y medio. 2 meses más tarde yo tuve que dar la noticia a mi esposa que el papá de ella había fallecido. Que es una noticia muy fácil de decir. 2 meses más tarde me acusaron, los compañeros míos de camerino me acusaron de una muerte de alguien. Cosa que yo no soy esa clase de persona y no lo hice. Y la razón que ellos lo hicieron es porque me odiaban, porque el trabajo mío era de dar disciplina en el camerino. Y a nadie le gusta que le den disciplina. Si yo te digo que llega a las 7, tú tienes que llegar a las 7. ¿Me entiendes? Tienes que llegar a las 7. Pero a nadie le gusta que le digan la verdad. Yo soy una persona que siempre digo la verdad. Hablando, salí bien, salí por la puerta ancha cuando me acusaron de aquella acusación. Los compañeros míos, cuando yo salí por la puerta ancha, no me felicitaron, me odiaron más. Por eso es que cuando yo llego al camerino de la IWA me siento igual. Nadie me quiere, me odian. Maniferno tiene muchos amigos en la IWA. Todos esos luchadores que van subiendo hoy en día son de la IWA. Maniferno los tiene en sus manos. Por eso que yo estoy preparado y tengo un amigo. Porque yo no voy a ir solo el día 30 en la cancha bajo techo de un mercado. No voy a ir solo, tengo un amigo que va conmigo.
Wow, no esperaba esa respuesta suya, no esperaba que me contara.
Falta un poquito más. Lo más triste de esta situación es mi esposa y mis hijos, con lágrimas en los ojos, me dicen que no me subo al ring. Porque es peligroso y yo lo conozco. A la edad que yo tengo, cualquier cosa va a pasar. Todo el mundo tiene la muerte segura. Puede morir de diferentes maneras y no lo sabemos cuándo o cómo vamos a morir. Mi familia teme que a mí me dé un ataque del corazón. Por una cosa yo te digo, a mí me puede dar un ataque del corazón. Lo único que pido es que el ataque del corazón me dé después que yo gane la cogida de la IWA. Y si yo gano esa cojea de la IWA y me da el ataque, que me entierren con la cojea dentro de la caja. Porque yo quiero llegar a ese Padre Celestial como campeón de la IWA. Así que, Maniferno, tienes un día difícil. Voy preparado. Y miren, amigo, este es el amigo. Esto a mí nunca me he fallado. Y sé que no me vamos a fallar. Y te pido, Sabio Vega, que no te metas en el medio. Porque si te metes en el medio, te voy a tumbar los dientes. Y tú conoces muy bien este puño. Mi amigo, que nunca en la historia de la lucha libre me ha fallado. Así que, Maniferno, ¿qué tú te vas a hacer cuando suene la campana el día 30 en la cancha bajo techo de un mercado?
And yeah, not sure if you were as pulled as I was the first time that I saw that. Surprised the other two can fit with his ego in the room. And the other thing that just doesn't fit is a true motive, this tacky propaganda piece aside. Something that I think we'll unfortunately never know. So there we go. The murder of a rising legend cut down in the prime of his career. And I hope you can see why I wanted to cover Frank Goodish. He was a dichotomy of opposites painting a complex person. He was categorically a monster in the ring, Even Mantell said he'd never wrestle Brody because he'd get the shit beat out of him. His words. But he was so respected by his peers that he held the man in awe, some still paying homage to this day. As you can tell from the clips, he was very intelligent and he had amazing business sense, understanding son was born. Quiet and thoughtful out of the ring, and a blur of violence inside. And he did something I've never seen a wrestler be able to do, which is be such a draw, to have such star power that they could go to any promotion, go into business for themselves, and then still be hired back at any of them because the promotions knew that they'd make the money. Imagine Stone Cold Steve Austin going to every wrestling federation, even in other countries, beating the ever-living piss out of the top stars, for real, and then getting invited to do it again. It's kinda wild, just like how crazy everything was handled in Puerto Rico, and the complete injustice wrought that day. And I don't think it's part of some grand conspiracy. I feel like a lot of this was an impulsive man's actions that was met with an ignorant police force that thought wrestling was real. Then most of the subsequent trial was a mixture of that ignorance and trying to keep this random murder of a foreigner as low profile as possible. I imagine a lot of the wrestlers were afraid to act out in fear of retaliation. Being in a country that is not your own and watching everyone act normal around the guy that just stabbed someone would also make me take reservation. But no matter where you land on Brody and his methods, the world lost a true legend and did not deserve the vicious death that he received, nor the appalling injustice that followed. I feel like Brody's perceptive takes would have done both the industry and its up-and-coming wrestlers a lot of good. And in the end, he will be missed by those that he cared about most. He would always carry a picture of his son Joffrey with him, still grasping at it as he faded away. And instead of my normal outro, I wanted to thank you all for watching today and let Frank have a few final words.
As I look back over 15 years, I don't say, oh, I wished I would have spent 15 years in the NFL. Certainly I would have been grateful to have 15 years in the NFL. But I'm equally as grateful to spend 15 good years in professional wrestling. And I'm 37 today. And I think that I probably got 10 more good years left in professional wrestling. Now, if I had 15 and I had 10, I'm looking at maybe 20 or 25 years in professional wrestling. I don't think there's anybody, maybe George Blanda, who can say they spent more than 20 years in the NFL. So I'm very happy with the way fate has taken its course. I didn't ever guess that I was going to be a professional wrestler. Once I started in professional wrestling, learned sort of the ropes and the ins and outs. If I had it to do over again, I think that I would probably even pass up my 3 years in the NFL and devote them to wrestling because it has been that good to me.
You said that's a great answer. Is there anything you want to add while we're talking?
No, I'm happy to be here, and I don't care about all those other wrestlers. If they don't want to come to the small towns, the rural communities, that's okay. Bruiser, Brody will always come, touch the people in every community from coast to coast.